were discussing the vision from Nicole, it seems the Lord revealed a few things. I had read through some of Emmanuel and Rachel's comments as well. Rachel had mentioned some things related to, the negative photos and of the sports being representative of old ways. In comparison to the life of the seed or the sapling in the soil. Brother Emmanuel also mentioned a similar contrast, with sports representing, a youthful way of life, competitive in nature and selfish, and also some of the timing of the driving. Noah will be driving soon. Noah and I were discussing, I asked him if he had any impressions, and he did mention that when he first heard the vision, that specifically related to the part when there was a transition and they get in the car to drive, he was immediately impressed that he was not the one driving, but that he was the passenger, and that someone else was driving. So seems to me like that is indicative of the Spirit, possibly even in terms of Noah's personal life related to some of the discipleship that it receives from Emmanuel, which I think again is symbolic of the leading of the Spirit. And as I thought about these things, seems the Lord revealed, I think, something very telling about this particular vision that I think is directly related to Noah's life in particular as a leader in a generation. But then it really gave me this generational picture. I believe that there are 4 generations represented in this vision, and they each generation represents a particular way or wisdom in relation to the Christian life or the life of the believers, the church, in that generation. The first being what I would consider my grandfather's generation, and I remember that I have Rachel's grandfather actually was the recreations director at their church, and that was a time when that kind of activity really represented a lot of what brought community and the idea of what it meant to be fulfilling, maybe the American dream. The church was very much interacting with the world in a way that, and with things that pleased the world. And so, interestingly, like I said, her grandfather was, a church had a director of recreation, so someone who specifically engaged the people of the church in sporting events. And I think that it's not just those activities that are telling, but the nature of those activities, as Brother Emmanuel mentioned, the competitive nature, youthfulness, selfishness, self-gratification, and pride, became a mark of that generation in the church, and how they were doing things. And so it wasn't obviously just directly related to sports so much as it was, the idea of how they were building the church and the community of God and the relationships there. Then in my father's generation, during the 70s, this was the time of the Jesus movement, which is when there was a real separation from that kind of activity, and then we saw a big transition in passion for the work of Christ, and I think that's represented by the red and white clothing in the dream. Red and white are many times in this light symbolic of Christ, the blood of Christ, and the cleansing that makes and cleanses the believer. And so if you study or research a little bit on the Jesus movement, you can see there's a lot of correlation there. Obviously, there was a vehicle and there was a leading that took place for this transition, which I think in many ways that generation, that would be, like I said, my father's generation, that were taken with this new passion and understanding of Christ and led to or taken to a different place. And the Spirit of God, was the lead in that transition. The product of that, and that's the interesting part about this vision, is that as they're driving on the passenger side, you have something spilling out, and it's almost like that was the product of that movement in that generation. Maybe not that movement in particular, but symbolic of one of the big moves in that generation. And the product was the spilling out of this fertile soil. And in many ways, I think that is representative of my generation, not myself, well, maybe myself, but my generation, which then gave way to another generation, that would be Noah's generation, that are being planted in the soil of this change, so we can see the progression of the generations through the vision. Now, the difference of this last generation, represented by the seedling or the sapling, the small tree in the dream, obviously a completely different way of life, planted in soil. It's not through the activities of man, and not even being carried anymore in this old vehicle. Although those were things that brought it to this place, but now this particular sapling grows rapidly and its branches reach to the heavens. And then we also see this demonstration of power, which we see that the branches go into this place. So there is the source of this law. It's almost like the picture here is that the source of this life is drawing its power from on high. And that, I think, is what indicates the greatest difference in this generation, is that the source of life and power is, quote-unquote, from on high. And it is the same place from which that power is also, in many ways, we have the darkness and trouble of the storm, but the tree itself, the plant itself, is unharmed or unmoved by that, and primarily because it's getting its power source, the source of life, from that. And so anyway, I really think that there is this is a picture of the last several generations, and the move of God and the work of God in the midst of the people of that generation working in a very particular way. And so there's some of my input and understanding on this vision.